Hello, Buddhist Geeks. This is Vincent Horn, and I'm joined today in a roundtable discussion. I guess we don't really have a table in front of us, but theoretically, Google Hangouts is round in some imaginary space, and we're sitting around a round table and talking. And I'm here today with David Vago, and Jake Davis. Really good to have you fellows on the show, and thanks for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, great to be here, Vince. I love these virtual spaces.
Yeah, it's quite fun. We were just talking before the interview that this medium has become much better in the last couple of years, and I'm probably going to curse myself now. We're going to have all kinds of issues, but it's really nice.
What did you say?
It is really nice though to just be here and seeing each other and talking across vast distances. I think the Buddhist contemplatives of yore, with all of their psychic powers, would still be probably overwhelmed by the amazingness of this.
Yeah, it's almost another form of this psychotechnology that we were talking about a little earlier.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let me share a bit about your backgrounds before we jump into the main topic, which is going to be exploring whether or not a neuroscience of enlightenment makes sense. David Vago has been here on the show before. He spoke at the last Buddhist Geeks conference. And is really at the forefront. I think both of you are at the forefront of this emerging field of contemplative science. David's been working on mapping the meditative mind. He's done a lot of collaboration with mindfulness teacher Shinzen Young, and was a former research coordinator at the Mind and Life Institute. Jake Davis is a longtime practitioner. He spent several years as a translator and monk in Burma, and is currently focused, after coming back from the monastic life, focusing on philosophy and cognitive science. He's specializing in philosophy of mind and ethics, and so is bringing a really interesting humanities and practice perspective. And both of you, I should mention, are longtime practitioners, and that's kind of the unique thing, I guess, about contemplative science, is you've got folks who are kind of trained in multiple disciplines, and are not just taking a third-person objective kind of approach to this stuff, but also the first-person introspective methods are part of what you're employing. So it's very interesting, to bring those two perspectives together.
Yeah, I would just even add that that's probably one of the most critical laboratory settings in which we can get insight from. So that's where we start, right? We start from our own experience.
Great.
Maybe the only thing to say there is I think that that's actually true, just underappreciated about science in general, and maybe psychology in particular, is that people actually have to start from their own intuitions and their own experiences to generate hypotheses. Of course, they're informed by the background of the literature, but a lot of people's interests and their hunches and what they're moving on is informed by their own experience,
Right.
and so it's just often underappreciated part of the methodology of science, but actually really crucial to appreciate them.
That's right, and it should also be, I think, talked about very explicitly that it doesn't necessarily mean that because you're practicing meditation that you're going to be biased towards the benefits of it, but you're trained as a scientist to be objective, and that's what you do objective work. Of course, there's always going to be your own insight that sort of informs your hypotheses, but it doesn't necessarily mean, which is a common criticism, is that it's going to bias the way you think of your outcomes. So, of course, that could be a problem in science, and that's in any field of science, that people's own feelings about what they're studying will bias their interpretation of the data. But that as a scientist, you have to be objective, and that's what we're trained to do.
Okay, cool. So a lot of interesting stuff there. We could probably have a whole interview just on philosophy of science.
Could say
and the way
something
that
on that same.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, and then we'll jump into the particular article that we want to explore. But yeah, feel free. Yeah, I told you I was going to curse myself.
Sure. So just one general thing on that same point. Yeah, totally. Being invested in a kind of a practice, and maybe even making your money from teaching it sometimes, can certainly bias your perspective. There's also a way in which just training the mind to be equanimous and careful actually should decrease those kind of biases. In fact, one of my sort of pet theories about mindfulness practice in particular is that that's part of the function of it, is precisely to decrease those kind of biases. I do think that it's important for us to take a critical perspective, and one thing I've been saying to people recently is precisely because there's so much hype, that's sort of what we've been calling the McMindfulness phenomenon. There's so much hype around mindfulness in particular, on the cover of Time and so on. It's actually more important now to bring a really critical perspective, and I think that one thing that's great about what's happened with the paper that Dave and I put out there is that it's generated some critique and discussion, and I think that that's a lot of fun for both of us, I know, but also I think more importantly for the field, is really important that there be this kind of critique going on.
And that was really just a starting point for thinking about the E word for us. Some of the reasons, some of the sort of the dialogue that happens about, or criticism that comes back and forth about whether we should even be thinking about a neuroscience of enlightenment, is a neuroscientist even qualified to talk about it? And some of the criticism is no, it should be anthropologists and philosophers more than neuroscientists. So I think that neuroscientists certainly add a perspective, and that if anybody's going to start talking about it, that people who are immersed in this field and who are surrounded by the philosophers and the Buddhist scholars should be the ones to initiate the dialogue. So I'm happy we were one of the first people to sort of really talk about it. I think the idea of spirituality, and the neuroscience of spirituality tried to push itself into mainstream neuroscience a few years ago, but really sort of failed at having a real strong sort of empirical backing behind it, and we still, I think, fail to really come up with a way to operationalize spirituality in a way that's culturally meaningful. So I think just by continuing to have this discussion, and starting right now with this paper, that we can really think about it in a way that's not necessarily divorced from the soteriological context from which it originates. So we can go back to this idea from the historical framework with Buddhist scholars like Jake and philosophers like Evan Thompson, and see what are we drawing from that context into this Buddhist modernism, or sort of the contemporary mindfulness movement that people are claiming to have experiences that may be associated with ideas of enlightenment. So we need to at least start somewhere, and I think we're doing that, which is great.
Yeah, and so this the article that you're talking about. I'll mention the title, and it's kind of geeky. Can enlightenment be traced to specific neural correlates, cognition, or behavior? ? No, and a qualified yes. So I'm pretty sure I'm pretty sure in terms of titling, journals like Frontier probably aren't trying to create buzz headlines in the same way that Huffington Post is. But it's really interesting for a couple of reasons. One, that you use the term enlightenment, like you said, and that's really unusual. I take it to even use the E word. Even calling it the E word sort of says something in a journal like this. Why did you choose to do that? I mean, you mentioned a little bit, but could you say a little bit more about why you guys decided to to kind of throw enlightenment in there instead of trying to use some other terminology?
Well, I should just give a quick background. So the paper came out in Frontiers in Psychology, and it was a special edition of the journal that focused on consciousness and contemplative practice and non-dual states of awareness, that was edited by Zoran Josipovich and Bernard Bars. And at one point, Zoran approached me and said, "Hey, we should talk about, whether there's a possibility for a neuroscience of enlightenment." And I said, "Okay, that sounds great and interesting. I'm not sure if I can say much about it, but I've been doing some work with Shinzen Young, as you mentioned, and he's writing a whole piece on the science of enlightenment. And not to devalue his opinion in any way, but I think that it's one-sided and one perspective that is needed in this whole debate. But there needs to also be the varied perspectives that people like Jake bring, like a Buddhist scholar brings to the table, as well as philosophers and anthropologists. We need to have a more broader discussion about it. And so that's when I asked Jake to join, and he immediately was interested. And Bernard Bars had some interesting points. Maybe Jake, you can talk a little bit about how Bernard Bars was a little bit critical of using the word enlightenment, and very cautious about putting it into a psychological or cognitive framework, and that was risky.
Yeah, so I can't recall precisely word for word what Bernie Barr's criticisms were. He was actually sympathetic to the idea of at least raising the question, but I think rightly he was pointing out that, for one thing, the term enlightenment, as we pointed out in the article, is really a reflection of his original sort of challenge, that the term enlightenment is used all over the place in many different contexts to refer to very different things. So as a first pass, no, there can't be a science of enlightenment, because first you have to get very specific about which cultural context, which tradition you're talking about, and even there are huge challenges. But the first pass is that we have to talk about a very specific tradition before we're going to get any kind of traction at all. And so that kind of critique, I think, as Dave was saying, requires people who've thought a bit about the Buddhist studies end of things, and also I actually identify more as a philosopher than as a Buddhist scholar, though I do have some background in both. Really thinking critically about these philosophical issues, one about the nature of experience and how it lines up with physical correlates, neurobiological correlates at all. And then on the other hand, thinking about issues of value, because to me, enlightenment is really a value term. It's something like the most valuable experience. Maybe that's how we should take it when people talk about enlightenment experiences. At least a very valuable experience, right? So if we're talking about valuable experiences, there's a whole discussion that goes on in philosophy and moral psychology and in ethics and what's called meta-ethics that pertains to what it is to value something and how we could go about studying that at all scientifically, or is it not possible to study these value questions at all from a scientific perspective. So all those perspectives seem really important given the kind of foundational questions, conceptual questions that Bars was raising.
And I just want to add also that, as this field focuses on trying to map the meditative mind to better understand basic mechanisms by which these practices are working, we also have to sort of put side by side, the historical model of practice of the Dharma, really, and the more modern contemporary mindfulness movement, which is mostly focused on MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction. And you put those two side by side, and the first thing you see are two very different sort of goal states. One is for stress reduction, and the other one, really, the goal is enlightenment. And that's, in some contexts, you hear enlightenment as being a goal. It's not necessarily one that you sit down and begin practice for, but it is an end state that typically can manifest through the practices. And so we can argue about some of the details associated with how much it really is a goal in the practice. But if we just at least approach the concept as part of the practice, then we have to at least be able to examine it, put it on the table, and say, let's talk about it, instead of just keeping it in a black box and just saying it's there, but we don't know what it means. Even though some people may experience it, we still don't want to talk about it. It's like a bad word. But and then the question I think that's most difficult is that it's hard to define and operationalize. You know, if you ask your average Buddhist practitioner or people who claim to be Buddhist, you say, what is enlightenment? You know, the question, would you get an answer that's consistent amongst practitioners? And probably not, right? You know, you probably wouldn't, and that's a problem, because you know, people are trying to identify some of the states that they're experiencing during their practice. Some people may claim to have a subjective experience that would declare that it's enlightenment while experiencing it, and some people may say that it's something that lasts, you know, longer than a fleeting moment. It could be something that you would call an enlightened individual, so it could be more trait-like. We need to at least explore these experiences, and whether or not they match the soteriological sort of way of thinking about it. So, you know, the context from which it originates or not. We are creating something, or at least we may be creating a new concept of enlightenment for the contemporary movement, but we need to identify what's consistent about these states. And just like we're trying to map, you know, the other aspects of meditation practice into, you know, neural correlates and substrates, we also want to put that on the map, enlightenment, and the associated phenomenological states or experiences that people have while practicing these meditation techniques. So I think that's one of the most critical points, is that, you know, somebody may be out there to declare that they have a subjective mental state that they felt enlightened while experiencing it, and that's important, and we have to contextualize that. And the neural correlates are just one part of the story. So I don't think we should avoid you know, using neuroscience techniques, but I understand the criticism that it shouldn't be the only tool that we use.
Okay, interesting. So, you know, just taking a step back, I mean, part of what I'm hearing both of you guys talk about in some sense is, you know, when you're investigating this question of neuroscience of enlightenment, is this even possible? Part of what I hear is challenging is almost like the difference between enlightenment in the singular and enlightenment as a plural type of situation. Like, you know, because the term enlightenment itself does seem to indicate like one thing, whereas what you guys are talking about, you know, if you ask many different people, you know, what their ideas are about enlightenment, or even many different people who think they're enlightened, what their experience of enlightenment, they're going to give different answers. So it sounds like it's a plural already, you know, clearly not a singular situation. What, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing to say is, on the ground, clearly people are making all sorts of claims, and so they're going to identify very different states and traits as enlightenment or enlightened. You know, one thing, just kind of thinking along the lines of what David was saying, it's not just that we're comparing the traditional model with the MBSR model. In fact, you know, there are hundreds and millions of traditional models. So we're comparing lots of models with actually lots of contemporary models, but say MBSR has a particular kind of dominance in the contemporary sphere, particularly in terms of scientific research on meditation. So there, absolutely, pluralism is part of the challenge, but for me, actually, what pluralism makes clear is a different kind of a challenge. It's a challenge about what's really valuable, and what kind of states really are valuable, or what kind of traits really are valuable. So basically, you know, when I hear somebody say, this is the enlightenment experience, I kind of translate it into, this is a really valuable experience. You know, we talked in the paper a little bit that, you know, the notion of enlightenment isn't so native, isn't so widely used in the Buddhist traditions. The bodhi, or awakening, is a more widely used kind of metaphor and term. Yep. But whatever term you want to use, essentially, to my mind, it's a value judgment. So you wouldn't expect, if you were to survey people, well, what's the right way to live? You wouldn't expect that they're in the world. You wouldn't expect that people from very different cultures are going to agree on that. And so I think it's similar with enlightenment. What's the most valuable experience? Well, they disagree about that, absolutely. And then what I'm interested in, sort of as a philosopher, and from this question of foundations of ethical theory, foundations of answers to the question, how should we live? I'm interested in, is there an answer to that? Is there an answer to what the most kind of valuable state is, or what the most kind of valuable trait is to have as a human being? Is there an answer to these questions, to some questions about how we ought to be and how we ought to live? And I think those are really the questions, the deeper questions that are raised by the specter of pluralism, in particular about the case of enlightenment, but it's actually a much more general question about value.
It is, yeah. And I would also add, you know, I mentioned this earlier too, but John Vervaeke, the guy at University of Toronto, talks about this idea of psychotechnology, basically an information processing tool designed for the mind to enhance its performance in some way. And I like using this term also in reference to mindfulness and the meditation practices that are associated with mindfulness, because what we're trying to do is essentially enhance the performance of the mind, to learn the wisdom necessary to survive and flourish as a human being. And what does that mean? And it's sort of talking specifically to what Jake is referring to as sort of these value judgments of what's good for a human being, what's really helping to enhance performance of the mind, an ability to, you know, I created this framework of self-awareness, self-regulation, and self-transcendence as a way to sort of frame the benefits of doing these practices, of what it can be to sustain a healthy mind, to be a flourishing human being. And at some level, all these elements of learning how to be meta-aware, how to regulate oneself, and how to transcend one's needs and wants of the self to improve pro-social skills like empathy and theory of mind, are all components of a flourishing human being, or this psychotechnology. And so enlightenment may just be sort of a sort of emergent property of what happens when you have all of these ducks in a row and you're flourishing. Just like, you know, Mathieu Ricard took the metaphor and said, you know, we all understand what a flourishing plant looks like. When you look at a plant and you see it's nice and green and doesn't, you know, it doesn't have little water spots or dead leaves, that's a flourishing plant. But what does it look like to be a flourishing human being? Is it easy to see, or do we have to develop tools to better understand them in objective ways, aside from the subjective reports? Because people could say that they're enlightened, of course. You know, I remember having lots of conversations with the Mormons, for example, when I was in Utah, and you know, their claims of communication with God, and in any case, I said, well, what if I said I had a communication with God when I was up on Alta, the ski area? And there was no way to deny that. So of course, if you say that you have a subjective experience of enlightenment, you can't argue with that, but we can qualitatively try to describe it and then see if we can come up with other objective tools like neuroscience to measure them and see if there's something consistent. And just to expand on that last point, we have to at least agree with the assumption that neuroscience, or that there's some worth and utility in using neuroimaging to find correlates or substrates of human experience. It doesn't matter whether it's depression or imagining movements of ballet, which is one of the examples that Evan gave, or enlightenment. We just need to at least agree that there's an assumption that there's utility in using that as a tool, and if so, then we can move forward and create a biobehavioral description of what we mean by enlightenment in this contemporary field.
Okay, interesting. And as I understand it, then, you know, the way that you all are approaching it, and certainly the way, David, that you've been approaching it in your research, is to start kind of narrow with a particular, you know, tradition or a particular methodology or particular, you know, set of ideas about what enlightenment is, and explore those claims and sort of investigate them empirically and see what's actually there in terms of a very specific notion, and then kind of going from there. Is that an accurate way of describing it?
Yeah, so we sort of approached this a little bit in our paper. We talked about a little bit from, well, we sort of went in reverse. I talked about the experience of cessation, and this gets a lot of people excited when we talk about cessation.
Which is ironic in a way.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so I think some practitioners out there talk about nirodha, in very contemporary settings. Well, for example, Shinzen Young talks about gone in two ways. One as a little g, and one gone as a big G. And little g is essentially, having an object, noting in a noting and labeling type of practice. You can note that an object has arisen in your phenomenal field of consciousness, and you can note that it disappears when it's gone. That would be gone with a little g. But gone with a big G would be when sort of all space and time drop out and you are experiencing what he refers to as big gone or cessation. Now, this has been debated whether or not it's truly a real experience of cessation as it's described in say, Mahasi tradition. And then we went back to talk about how it's described from the Mahasi tradition, and that's where Jake really critically examined how it really was described from that contextual soteriological viewpoint. Oh, is that I hear alarms?
It's just the noon. The noon. I don't know. There's a siren that goes off at noon.
Maybe that means that we're talking about something that's dangerous.
Maybe. My own take on that.
Yeah, I wanted to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had 2,000 words. It was an opinion piece, so I wouldn't. Go ahead.
No, please. I just wanted to hear kind of your experience with this.
What were you gonna say, Vince? Oh, just we had 2,000 words. It was an opinion piece, and so I wouldn't say in any way it was a thoroughgoing analysis of the Mahasi, notion of cessation. And there's a lot more to be said on many different angles. One is just that as in many traditional presentations, the notion of awakening in that context and cessation in particular is very much tied to an understanding of rebirth and the end of rebirth and things like this. And we weren't doing that in the paper. We were doing it in a phenomenological sense, and then wondering, could this phenomenal experience, kind of experiential perspective, be traced scientifically or not? And I think some of the criticisms we've got, as I say, we're both really excited that it has generated criticism, because I think this kind of critical thinking together is crucial to the long-term sustainability of the field of contemplative science, and then actually to the long-term sustainability of whatever value these teachings have in our culture. I think thinking critically about it is extremely important to its long-term welfare. So that said, one of the critiques that we've got is that, look, you can't divorce even this sort of experience from those larger cultural contexts and go trace it scientifically. And I guess at that level, maybe I just disagree. I think that people do certainly have ideas about the causal effects of these kinds of experiences, and different ideas in different traditional contexts. But nonetheless, it may be possible, they may agree that certain experiences do constitute a kind of awakening, maybe something like stream entry, a first level of awakening or something like that. There might be enough agreement about what constitutes that then we can have a different discussion about what the causal effects are of that or not. But that we can talk about the experience itself separate from those, and then investigate that neuroscientifically. And that's a question, whether that's possible or not. I think Dave and I have a bet on one side about that, and that's the way these debates go.
What's the bet?
Maybe that's all I have at the moment.
I mean,
that we can, that there is something, there's enough of a coherence and enough of a convergence on what people would take within a specific cultural tradition, would take to be an experience of stream entry, that we can then, causal effects of that are on rebirth or not, or so on, but that can be a separate discussion, and that's not constitutive of what the experience is, that the experience has an identity separate from those ideas about what it causes. Is that clear?
Yeah, and
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, and we're on the same page here. It probably would be nice to have someone like Evan on talking with us at this point, just because he offers a sort of a very different opinion about
this
it.
is Evan Thompson, who's one of your, I guess, one of your mentors.
Yeah, really, he has been sort of a guiding force, or more of a moral compass for us all in this
I'm
field.
sure I'll appreciate that description.
Yeah, which is great, and that's really important to have someone like that. And he's, we have these dialogues a lot on Facebook, which come out very spontaneously, and it's wonderful to see how we can have these some of the best dialogue I think in the field sometimes happens just on a whim from somebody's Facebook post.
Interesting.
Yeah, so which also maybe even speaks to the where our contemporary movement is. We're moving towards, how humans connect at the level of the internet. Buddhist Geeks itself has a virtual sangha. That's amazing. So I think one of the most important things about this emerging field is that it's still emerging. Thousands of years passed between the different wheels of turning the Dharma wheel, right? So each turning of the wheel was a long period of time between each turning. Some people even consider this the fourth turning. That this whole movement is really a new way of the Dharma being expressed in a more contemporary way. So it's going to involve a framework that fits into a contemporary setting, and it's not the same as it used to be. You certainly don't. It's certainly not a monastic setting for most people. A lot of people are getting these techniques at their doctor, or just going to a Dharma talk here by this person, or getting some sort of online chat, or maybe they're listening to this and they're getting some sort of insight out of it. I don't know, but it's not the same framework that the Buddhist models are used to. And I say Buddhist models with an S because, as Jake was saying, there's a lot of different traditions that we're referring to, a lot of different schools of Buddhism that I often sometimes forget to make that clear, and lump it all into one. But I guess my point is here that there may be some growing pains as we go through this fourth turning. Ken Wilber certainly likes to think of it as a fourth turning, and some of those growing pains means trying to figure out what these states are that we're experiencing phenomenologically as we do these practices. For the long-term people, it may not happen in 8 weeks. And in many cases, as we know, some of the main issues in our field is that the interventions for clinical problems such as depression or anxiety sometimes or often don't even use meditation. They just have this sort of orientation towards one's thoughts that is sort of one part of the spectrum of some of the experiences that you would have doing participating fully in the Dharma. So everything from just an orientation towards one's thoughts to actually sitting formally for a long period of time, to a long-term practice, and even in a monastic setting, has some sort of spectrum of experience. And the common factors or the common threads are the actual meditation practices. So we can explore those and say what phenomena are consistently experienced when you do these practices, whether it's in an 8-week MBSR course or whether it's in a monastic setting. We want to know, are you experiencing something that people are calling stream entry, and what does it look like, what does it feel like, and how do we probe those experiences?
Okay.
Maybe I could add a couple of things to that.
Great.
My own take on some of this is that there is, even just in a moment of really paying attention in a gentle, curious way, equanimous way to what's happening in our present experience, there's the seed of kind of all of the Buddhist teachings. And so part of the critique, I think, David was talking about this idea of the fourth turning of the wheel and the adaptation, and I think there is inevitably going to be adaptation. Every time the Buddhist teachings have moved into a new context, there's been all sorts of adaptations. I think one critique or one worry, legitimate worry, is that there's nothing the same, that there's no continuity, and that there's nothing really timeless about these teachings that is being carried through those. My own take is that there are some aspects that are really there and very much the same for any human being in virtue of the way that human beings and human psychology and human experience is constructed. So one of those things that I think is constant is that there's a way in which the aspects of discipline, Dave was mentioning the monastic kinds of life, and all the way through enlightenment experiences are really, there is a continuity, and just in virtue of the way human beings are, to the degree we're really paying attention in what I'm thinking of as a mindful way, all of that is contained. On the one hand, to the degree we're really cultivating that, it will lead to certain experiences, and it's a testable question whether it leads to convergent experiences, whether people who are practicing in these same ways do report the same kinds of experiences when these are practiced at a kind of depth and continuity and thoroughness. And on another level, I also think that to the degree we're really paying attention to what it's like to be motivated in different ways, to what it's like to be motivated by hatred or by greed versus what it's like to be motivated by equanimity or by compassion, that any human being will know which is a better way to be, and will be able to discern which ways of living are wise, which ways of being motivated are wise. And to the degree that's true, I think it has implications for ethics. It may be that it has the implication that monasticism is not just a relic of the past, that in fact monastic ways of life are a really important aspect of these teachings. And although the current delivery is very secularized and divorced from a lot of those contexts, I think it may actually contain a seed of a lot of radical things. On the one hand, the radical kind of freedom that's possible with the sort of experiences that get referred to as enlightenment in different contexts. And on the other hand, the radical kind of differences in lifestyle. So I think of these teachings as a real challenge to our current values, as much as it also affirms some central aspects of things that we already value.
Okay, interesting. I didn't see the monastic challenge coming, and that's an interesting one, especially because you spent some time living in that way. And I think there's one debate which we've been exploring a lot on Buddhist Geeks, which is are those conditions a requirement for certain kinds of experiences, or are they in some sense assumed to be requirements because that's the way it's been done? And then I think there's another question which you raised, which is almost entirely different, which is, how does living in a particular way, with a particular lifestyle, affect your mind, and not even in terms of experiencing certain kinds of experiences like cessation or whatever, but just how does that affect your experience as a human being, and what sort of things come out of that are kind of unique.
And the other way around too. How does your being motivated in certain ways, in a really pure way, how does that manifest in a life? And I think in your lifestyle choices. So it might just be that, and I'm not sort of asserting this. I think it's an interesting question, and it ought to be the kind of questions that we start to take on. These questions about how does ethical behavior manifest when people are motivated by different motivations. So how does ethical behavior manifest when we're motivated by greed, and how does behavior manifest when we're motivated by called the divine abidings, by equanimity and compassion? And I think it seems to me an open question. Well, maybe if we're really motivated in these pure ways, it would often. Different people are in different conditions, but when people have the right conditions, it might often manifest in the choice to live monastic lifestyles if those institutions were there. So for me, it's actually less a question about what's possible experientially. I kind of think that maybe a huge amount of the value of meditation practice is available in a lay life. What actually strikes me more is for the long-term benefit of multiple people. So it may be that the model of teaching, of lay teachers teaching on a dana basis is not very sustainable. That strikes me as quite plausible, actually, that having to sustain a house and so on as a lay teacher is really hard, not just on the teacher, and people don't have a lot of security who are doing that often, but also hard on the community in the sense that there's a lot of finances that are necessary just to sustain that kind of lifestyle. And secondly, that a huge number of you have to be running huge numbers of people through meditation centers to do that. To me, actually the value, a lot of the value of monasticism is providing the economic conditions of living really frugally so that you can have teacher-student relationships that are one-on-one and sustained over years and decades. That seems to me the long-term value for the sustaining of the value of these teachings that monasticism brings most centrally.
Yeah, and that it brings up a critical point, and sort of a big hole in this field is having the ability to track students' progress without having the student-teacher relationship being cultivated for long periods of time, longer than 8 weeks even. I mean, the 8-week program is really become sort of a model program, and that's it. See you later. Good luck. Have fun. And then we sort of leave people to their doings, and they have, they may have questions, they may have troubles. How do you know what's going to happen to them afterwards? We don't. And I think as the field continues, I think the teachers and as scientists, we're going to have the responsibility for tracking people's progress beyond 8 weeks, and looking at not just the biology or the neuroscience of people's neuroplastic changes over time, which I think is critical, but the behavior. And what Jake has been emphasizing is the ethics, and we know that the ethics are actually often undervalued in a lot of these contemporary settings where we focus mostly on attention and emotion regulation as sort of a performance enhancement. Again, going back to the psychotechnology and the benefits of using mindfulness in this way, but the ethical component, contributing to skills like empathy, theory of mind. We know that may be the foundation for transforming some of the maladaptive habits and dispositions that we all have, and whether they're implicit or explicit, these sort of ethical components are certainly necessary for cultivating really important things for being a flourishing human being, cultivating love, patience, tolerance, forgiveness, humility. All these types of things lead to ethical behavior, which we know, again, are sort of the foundation for creating a sustainable, happy human being.
And not to mention a human society.
And a society,
That's
exactly. Right. I worry a little bit about what Trungpa referred to as spiritual materialism, and this idea of wanting to be the all-compassionate, mindful, enlightened human being. And claiming to be that is like wearing something on your chest saying, look how enlightened I am, I'm so special. And people are then sitting down to practice to reach that state. It reminds me of this cartoon where you see these two people meditating next to each other, and one of them's like, I reached enlightenment first. You're dust. You eat my dust. It's like, see you later.
Now
that becomes sort of a competitive thing to who's going to experience stream entry first, and then how do we know that they're really experiencing stream entry? We don't even know what stream entry really is. So
right.
We need to better qualify these things in sort of objective ways, and that's what we're really just trying to do.
Nice, and I love that you bring. Sorry, if I could interject this one thing. I love that you bring that up because and this is maybe a question for you both, because if you guys are, successful, or your colleagues are successful at seeing certain patterns, biological markers, behavioral markers, etc., and calling that, whatever, this is a particular form of enlightenment, then, in some sense, you're opening the door for competitive enlightenment, for in a way that and what I would say is, like, I hear that perspective, that it can be of limited use to be like, I'm the most enlightened person, but and some people, but if you look at any other field where you can quantify people's skills, there is competition, and Michael Jordan didn't need to be like, I'm the best basketball player in the world and have a huge ego about it. He may have, I don't know. I didn't know him personally, but I'm sure there are a lot of people that are quite humble and are still the best at whatever they do.
That's
so
true. And
you guys are opening the door to this, in some ways.
Right, and Michael Jordan's a good example because he showed his skill through performance. And so if you are, and that's behavior. And if you're a real enlightened person, maybe you are just much more humble and loving and pro-social, and we can start to look at that from a behavioral point of view. But and I think you bring up one of the most other important critiques of this type of science is creating maps. Is there a benefit to creating a map? And you go back, and Jake, I would love to hear your comments on this. What were the historical sort of well, first of all, were there maps created for the teachers to sort of map the progress of their students or not? And it seems like there are some opinions about whether or not some of the original lineage holders had some form of a map to help navigate and identify markers of progress by the students.
Well, the answer to that is yes, but to say a little bit more, it's tough to know actually in any detail very far back. It's very clear that Mahasi Sayadaw, was living in, I guess, now the last century, but his tradition, certainly did formulate the kind of maps that you're talking about in phenomenological and behavioral terms, markers of progress along a path. It wasn't designed or set up to be amenable to, say, neuroscientific investigation in the way that maybe some more modern teachers even are thinking of, just because they have this scientific worldview in a different way. I do think that this idea of spiritual materialism is really important to bring out and for us all to be careful of in ourselves. I mean, it needn't stop at stream entry either. Somebody could have a stream entry experience and then be getting materialistic about the final enlightenment, right? But I actually do think there's a way in which fully embodying these practices itself purifies that kind of a motivation, for the reason that I was saying. To the degree somebody's really feeling what it's like to be motivated by greed versus what it's like to be motivated by equanimity, I think that they can feel the difference for themselves, and the one is just more painful than the other. To the degree we're really feeling it fully, we can't bear it. And so in a certain way, the antidote to spiritual materialism about mindfulness is mindfulness. But we all need to sort of live that practice. And I do think that part of what I was interested in bringing out, talking about the E word, is to really bring out the ways in which this is not just an instrumental behavioral intervention for pain management and so on, which isn't in any way a critique, because I think that the seed of not just relief of reactivity to pain, but also the relief of the kind of reactivity that leads us to be spiritual materialists, the seed of all that goodness, of all that wisdom, is right there in applying mindfulness in a certain way. To the degree we can do that in a continuous and thorough and pervasive way in our lives, we can cultivate that kind of being wise.
Great. I would add, too, another antidote, Jake, and I'd be curious to see what you think. I think one other antidote is not confusing third-person descriptions of patterns over time with the first-person experience of either being, having hubris around whatever you think you've achieved versus being humble. I mean, there's a difference in describing some sort of territory from the outside, like a researcher might, and from the inside being like, oh, I'm so special because I've experienced this.
Could you say a little bit more about how that third person and first person, there's certainly a difference between third person, first person. How does that apply to the, I think you're probably onto something. I'm just trying to get clear to the hubris issue.
Yeah, so one of the issues that I hear in this conversation, I'm not sure how relevant it is to your research, but it seems relevant because you guys are kind of your first person, practitioners and third person researchers, and I think, we're moving between those two perspectives quite rapidly in this conversation, and we went from talking about objective maps of biocorrelates and behavioral correlates, of being able to map that out in some sense, to being concerned about spiritual materialism, which to me is a first-person concern, not a third-person concern. It's
Well,
a
how about
concern
second person? I mean, I'm concerned for
that's
people.
true too.
I'm concerned for my friends, and to the degree I'm a friend to myself. I'm concerned for myself when I get spiritually materialistic. Why?
Right.
Because it's a state of greed, and that's painful. If anybody was really feeling what that's like, it's painful. So in a way, it's a sort of it's not that highfalutin. It's really kind of simple. Being motivated in unskillful ways is painful, and being motivated unskillfully for an idea of enlightenment is just as painful as being motivated in any other unskillful way.
Right, and not having any clear sense of what you're doing is also quite painful. Being deluded about what you're doing. So
That's
hence,
right.
These maps.
That's absolutely right. In
can be
fact,
quite helpful.
Yeah, again, it sort of speaks
the maps can
to...
be helpful, but I think more, maybe this brings it back. Oh, sorry. Just quickly, maybe more important in a certain way than the third person mapping is just the second person continuity of having good friends. Kalyanamitta is really crucial for each of us to check ourselves against. When we are getting hubristic in a certain way, we can look at a third person map or a third personal description and still delude ourselves pretty well in thinking about it rationally. And if we're interacting with another human being face to face, it's hard. It's easier for them to see, at least, and to call us if they are fiercely compassionate, which I think is another aspect of being wise. Not just being pro-social and loving all the time. Sometimes being wise really means being fiercely compassionate and calling people on their bullshit when they're bullshit.
Yeah, it's funny. Just to bring a funny point. Where I practice yoga also, and the yoga sort of has its own growing pains of how it fits into contemporary this contemporary movement of maybe mindfulness, really, because it's sort of an integrating of Hindu philosophy as well. And you're in this yoga class, and everyone seems to be practicing all these sort of ethical, sort of pro-social types of experiences. At least seems that way because the teacher is telling you to on each other's mats, and then I leave the classroom and my reflection is always, what a bunch of assholes. They just practice all this yoga and there's still a bunch of assholes. I don't understand. So it's like, okay, you can sit on a cushion and for long periods of time. But it's really your behavior off the cushion that is most important, I think. If you finish your meditation session and then get off your cushion and go, hurt somebody, whether it's mentally or physically, I don't see that you're really progressing much. Even if you were able to experience some sort of deep state of samadhi or concentration, what is that doing for you as a human being, for yourself, and for the people around you? So again, I think that this materialistic part of this emerging field is a critical one, because we claim to be explicitly training people in compassion, for example, and then you don't see the behavior matching the training. People even with self-report measures, which we use mostly in science for compassion, for example, or mindfulness, don't match up with people's meditation experience often, and are not very good metrics of people moving through or advancing through their practice. If we think things like self-awareness, self-regulation, and self-transcendence are markers of a flourishing human being, then we should be able to see it behaviorally as well, and we don't have good objective measures for doing that. Our self-report measures are people saying, yes, I am very mindful, yes, I'm very self-compassionate, I'm an extremely compassionate human being. But we need to be a little bit better at quantifying what people really are and how they are, because we're just, again, it's a materialistic sort of medal that people are trying to wear on their chest, that they're saying, I'm a compassionate, mindful human being, and everyone please take note.
So two things come to mind. The one is, and you're well aware of this, Dave, just that for kind of a more general audience, you expect in any population there to be a normal distribution, so you'd see on any given trait, you'd see that there's a lot of people kind of around the middle, and then as you go toward the extremes, you're going to have less and less people. You're going to have outliers. So I have this pet theory that a lot of the people who actually get involved in meditation, are probably true of yoga too, are actually kind of on the lower end of the bell curve, in the sense that we need it, right? So maybe that's why we got involved. Right. And so if you were just to take a slice of people who've been meditating, maybe we shouldn't expect to see anything above and beyond the normal level of mindfulness or ethical behavior in the population, because maybe it's just like where they came from was like really tangled up, and now they're a little bit less, but they haven't quite got to the way as flourishing, say, as wise as most people are. That's possible. I think we should hold that kind of cheeky critique in the background when we're thinking about the.
Well, that's a critical point in the science itself.
And then
we're not anywhere near understanding where people are coming from at baseline. I think that's a huge problem in the literature, is understanding where people are, in a trait-like way. Maybe maybe people's trait-like dispositions towards empathy and pro-social behavior in general are indicative of where their potential is, and that's where we should be starting. Rather than saying, look, people start, at self-report level A and end up at self-report level B, and see what mindfulness did. It changed them. I think it's important that we understand people's sort of personality characteristics at baseline and understand what that means. I mean, if we can relate it to karma, great. If we can say that there's some past life that sort of influenced where you are today, wonderful. But certainly science at this point in time is not willing to embrace the possibility that past lives are influencing where your personality characteristics bring you out into your teens, minus all the sort of environmental factors that influence how you develop. But important aspect of the science for sure.
So a second thing is that there's been one of the critiques, I think, of the move that Dave and I were making and trying to start a conversation about this question: can there be a scientific investigation of enlightenment? And maybe in particular because part of our move was to say, look, you can't do that in general. You have to do it for a particular tradition. And so we picked a kind of development of the Mahasi tradition and the development of it, say in Shinzen's style of teaching, Shinzen Young. So one critique is to say, well, look, you guys are just arguing, you're using neuroscience to try and argue for the value of one particular traditional value conception of one particular kind of experience. I think a different way to take our empirical bent on this question in a more cheeky way is to say, well, maybe, but here's a different take would be to think of it as, look, if we could get a kind of neurobiological operationalization of certain enlightenment experiences, that would, as much as it would allow us to say, wow, all these people who show this neurophysiological characteristic also show really incredible behavioral manifestations, just act really wisely, it could equally show that they don't. They're all over the place, that some of them act really wisely and some of them don't. So I think my general take is not to advance the value judgments of any particular tradition as much as to really subject all of them to the best kind of critique that we can, so we can see what comes out true. I'm really interested in how we ought to live, and I want to know, and I think that bringing all of the methods to bear that we can in this kind of collaborative way, with scientists and humanists, is absolutely the way to go.
Yeah. And I quoted this in one of these Facebook posts, but Carl Sagan said, science is far from a perfect instrument of knowledge, it's just the best we have.
Nice. It was funny you're thinking of Sagan. I was thinking of Richard Feynman's quote, that nature reveals herself to us. It's not that we're sort of going out to try to, as you said, Jake, to impose certain kind of beliefs about how it is, but we're just kind of subjecting it to a critical look and seeing how it actually reveals itself.
Yeah, that's great.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for taking the time. I know we've probably, in some sense, just scratched the surface of this topic.
Yeah.
but thank you for your reflections and for for the work that you're doing. And I know it's time for the World Cup. If you're kind of follower of that, so of that religion. So
yeah, right.
For those that are tuning in live, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for everyone for tuning in live. That's great. I hope everyone's all fired up now. They're gonna be posting on Facebook and emailing and getting people to talk about this topic. So look forward to that.
Absolutely. In terms of scratching the surface, I think both Dave and I are really intending just to scratch the surface, because we're hoping that we don't think we could be the final word, and we're really hoping for the critique to get the discussion going. So if people have critiques, please reach us. We would love to hear them and have the continuing conversation.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Take care.